All right, ladies and gentlemen, now we're going to have a look at art of the Northern Renaissance. This will be a fairly short presentation. Most of the forms that we'll be looking at here are painting, portraiture, etching, and landscape. So we'll get right into it. I'm going to kind of go region by region here a little bit. First, we'll look at Germany, and two artists in particular that we'll look at side by side. Remember how I said that to some extent, the Northern European artists tended to look a little bit more at religious themes and imagery. On the left-hand side, we see here Matthias Grunewald's Isenheim altarpiece from 1515. This is a very complex work. It's part of an altarpiece, so there's one panel that has this crucifixion, but there are several doors, hinged doors, that are over top of that slide. There's a reliquary on one side of it that can be opened with small statuary there. But this is probably the most famous portion of the altarpiece, that alongside the Temptation of St. Anthony. This work has certain historical accuracies about it, for instance, the height of the cross, but there are also allegorical elements to this. For instance, you can see down here, well, not so allegorical, that's stretching a bit too far, but there's quite a bit of symbolism is the better expression to use. Here you have the lamb with its leg upraised. This is a symbol for the crucified Christ. You can actually see very faintly here, there's a little cross over the lamb's shoulder here. There is blood coming out of the lamb. It's pouring into a chalice. Over here is a patent. So this is where the bread would be held. Between the chalice and the paten, those are the traditional elements that you would have, the hardware that you would have for serving communion or the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. So there's that element to it. So if this was a Eucharist was being done, this might be the particular panel that was being shown. Over here you have the evangelist. It's a kind of a bit of a combination figure. Some people will say it's John the Baptist. Others will say it is the evangelist John. The dress, the costume, it's very much John the Baptist, and I believe that is what the language here, the few words that are written here, indicate this is John the Baptist. But he's holding the book in his hand, which is the traditional posture for an evangelist, to hold the words of Scripture and then indicate to Christ. Over here you have the two Marys. You have Mary Magdalene, you have Mary the mother of Jesus, and you have the beloved disciple. This is also a John. So there's kind of a Johannine balancing act on both sides of the cross here. The figure of Christ is elongated, the elongated proportions. That's a very common feature of crucifixion images, that the limbs will be elongated in order to give the effect that they are lifeless. The fingers are very long, they're very tortured, the body is pockmarked. If you compare this, for instance, to Michelangelo's Pietà, Mary holding the crucified and buried dead Christ before the burial. If you were to actually stand that Christ up next to that Mary, he would be proportionally much larger. That's where you get this sort of lifelessness, is by actually making the figure of the Christ larger. Up here, another element of symbolism, if you're not familiar with it, is the I, the letters I and RI. This is a reference to the phrase "Iesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum." That is a language that, according to the Christian narratives in the Gospels, Pontius Pilate, the governor of Palestine, of Judea, had put over top of the cross. And this was located in what was, for all intents and purposes, a kind of a religious order that held a hospital. So this would be kind of in a hospital ward. There would be sick people that would be in and out. And most of the sick that were treated in this place had skin diseases. And so many have suggested that's why Grunewald made the figure of Christ here, the flesh, covered in boils, covered in sores, and so on. The message that's being sent through the work is that through the Christian idea that through the crucifixion of Christ, the sins of humanity, the woes of humanity are healed, humankind is saved, and so that those who are in this hospital ward will also find peace, healing, salvation through the healing work of Jesus of Nazareth. On the right-hand side, you have a secular work, a self-portrait done by the great German artist Albrecht Dürer. There's something common to both of these works. Dürer is in one sense taking on the character that is a bit of a trope of the artist who is misunderstood. And of course, who does he make himself look like but a Christ figure? So we can draw all sorts of things, conclusions about Dürer's personality from that. Also noting that Dürer made several self-portraits of himself throughout his life, both in painting and in woodcuts. Woodcut really, though, is what Dürer is best known for, and here we have two examples. One of them on the left-hand side is a classic example of the sorts of things that he would do for illustrating Bibles as Bibles became more commonly printed. Of course, there was no way of, certainly no kind of photography, so the only way that you could put images into any printed books would be to make a wood cutting, either that or you could etch into certain metals. So you'd make a template, you would ink that in the same way that you would ink a printed page, and then you would be able to have these black and white prints accompany the printed page. So this is the Knight, Death, and the Devil on the left, and then on the right you have the portrait of a Moorish woman. So this is very interesting here. So this is a work of art that is now really taking into account European encounters with the outside world, and that is very much part of the Renaissance. Now, it's true that Europeans were always coming into contact with people who were outsiders, so to speak, foreigners. The Crusade period is when most Europeans are really in contact with folks who are not from Europe itself. They're traveling to the Holy Lands. They're to North Africa and so forth. And there's this cross-cultural exchange that comes along with warfare. But this is a moment when the crusading zeal had really started to die down. But 1521, this is post-Columbus. So now we're starting to see Europeans taking an interest in the wider world, and that even means the world's a little bit closer to home. It also occurs after the expulsion of the Moorish population from Spain. So when Europeans are sort of struggling with this attitude of, do we embrace foreigners? Do we reject them? How do we treat them? How does that shape the European identity? It's at a time when, while Muslims are being expelled from Spain, in Eastern Europe, and Southeastern Europe especially, the Turkish Empire is advancing up through the Balkan Peninsula, conquering the Kingdom of Hungary, and threatening the borders of the Holy Roman Empire, which is what Dürer would have been very familiar with. So again, there's this back and forth, this fascination with the outsider and this fear of the outsider. It is notable, of course, that this figure here is both female and non-European. As I mentioned in the introduction to this particular lecture, that we'd be looking at landscapes from the Northern Renaissance. This is something that really Northern Renaissance artists were very fascinated with. It's not something we see so much with the Italian Renaissance. Here we have, there's a couple of names that this work can go by the Netherlandish Flemish artist Pieter Bruegel the Elder, 1565, you see the dates there. Sometimes it's called The Return from the Hunt or Hunters in the Snow. But the hunters really aren't the important part of this work. You could see them down here in this section of the painting with their hunting dogs and so forth. Really, it's the vast landscape off into over this small village clustered in here, these lakes, mills, and then off into the far distance and into the mountains. Bruegel uses the tree line here. Notice the trees in that are trailing off into the distance. They're getting smaller as you recede into the painting, that recessional space. The one issue, though, is that this would not be properly called, would not properly have a horizon line or a vanishing point per se. There's something a little bit not so scientific about this kind of perspective. It's not linear perspective in the same sense that we saw either with Raphael or we saw with Masaccio. But there's definitely what's called atmospheric perspective, and that was something that was used by the Greeks and the Romans. It means that as you get off into the background here, it sort of gets hazier and bluer in the background. The blues are very prominent in this particular work regardless, especially the contrast between the white and the blue. But it's not that same kind of scientific perspective that we've seen with what we call linear perspective, what art historians call linear perspective. So Durer is a sort of bit transitional in that sense, but nevertheless, it's a remarkable work of not only landscape, but also of showing common folk engaging in common pursuits. And that's really another major interest of these Northern Renaissance artists, where you rarely see commoners depicted at all in Italian works of art. Here's another example of Bruegel. Classic. This is the fight between Carnival and Lent. It's this idea that the two seasons, Carnival, which is the last great celebration before Lent, which is preparation for Good Friday and Easter and so forth in the Christian calendar. Lent is a time when people give up things to eat. Oftentimes they give up meats and so forth. And Carnival is sort of the last-ditched, celebration before the time of sackcloth and ashes and deprivation come in. And so that's what he's depicting here, the community as it's sort of preparing for that new season and still wanting to celebrate a little bit, maybe being a little bit hungover from Carnival, and yet Lent is on its way. It's a time for piety and sober minds, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a gloomy time, but it's not a big party, let's put it that way. So you have all the sorts of accoutrement of the carnival celebration with sort of, hand-pulled carts. We use floats today and so forth and so on, right? But again, this is showing communal life, people doing everyday things, and observing the calendar of festivals and feasts and so forth was an everyday thing. We might say that this is extraordinary today. This sort of thing doesn't happen, but that certainly was part of everyday life. The number of feast days, the number of religious observations and celebrations were quite significant during the early modern period. Another great northern artist, Hans Holbein, the portrait painter, starting to capture the sense of royal power as it begins to accumulate. Portraits of monarchs become very common. Here's one of Henry VIII from 1540. This is later in life, so he's the classic image of the Renaissance prince, the kind of stout, imposing, the European or the English Caesar. Next is a curious work by another Germanic artist, Hieronymus Bosch, The Garden of Earthly Delights. This is a triptych. This is, in a sense, like a religious painting. Oftentimes, religious paintings came in these trifold sections, so that if this is a hinged door here, these can fold over to cover the central panel. Very common, you'd put that behind an altar. Often there was one scene in the center and two different scenes flanking the side that were related to the central scene. So essentially what you have here. In some works, There'll be a Madonna and Jesus. There'll be a crucifixion, and on the sides there will be angels, or there'll be people looking at the cross, or there'll be the patrons will be depicted over on the side panels, something like that. This is entirely different, and it still mystifies art historians today what exactly Bosch was going on about. It totally gives away all the emphasis on realism and naturalism, and indulges in this abstract fantasy land that is just really, really hard to determine what he's going on about, except for the fact that you kind of have over here, you can, if you read it left to right, you sort of, I guess, have the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, and God, and right, and all those sorts of things. And it's sort of pristine and unspoiled, and there's animals running around in the background. And then you have this central image of humankind doing all kinds of strange things with each other. And if you look very closely at the detail of this, there's so much going on in this, it's very hard to see. There's all sorts of strange behavior going on in this. Lots of berries being carried around, horses running around on a track, human beings cavorting with each other. This is, you could say, the nature of sin. Okay, and human beings behaving badly. And so therefore, over on this side, you have a depiction of hell. And there's all kinds of sharp instruments and hatchets and knives and swords and things all sticking out every which way on this. Again, look at a detail of this sometimes, and you know, just take in little sections at a time. There's so much going on. But still, again, it mystifies us as to exactly what he was thinking when he created this work. And also, we can say that even though there is that relation, you know, let's say it's the Garden of Eden and so forth, this is really not the kind of work that would have been found. This was certainly not church commission. This would have been virtually incomprehensible in terms of its imagery to any Christian layman or any Christian theologian or preacher or priest or at all. So this was most likely commissioned for a private holding, a private person. The next two slides, we're going to look just briefly at some royal establishments here. This is Clouet's portrait of Francois I. We talked about Francis in another lecture. Great Renaissance prince, patron of the arts, king of France for an extended period of time, roughly 1515 to 1547. And a chateau that he commissioned in the French Renaissance style, the Chateau de Chambord, built again over a long period of time, most of Francis's reign. Chambord became the model of other kind of fantastic Renaissance type palaces, in the same way that Louis XIV's Versailles will become the palace which will be replicated throughout much of Europe in the late 17th and 18th century. But we don't quite know. It's disputed as to who the architect was for Chambord, and there were several different architects over time, and it's this kind of it is unified in a certain way, but it's this kind of rambling hodgepodge of fantasy that in some ways parts of it are a bit of a throwback to the Middle Ages. There's certain elements of that, but it really does stand out as the harbinger of the French Renaissance style. If we move south of the Pyrenees, now we see the examples of the Spanish Renaissance. This is much more common to what, let's say, a more classicizing symmetry that we see coming out of Italy kind of Renaissance architecture. But there's something else about El Escorial, the great monastery palace, and that's key. It's a monastery and a palace. It has a kind of bureaucratic efficiency about it. It is straight lines, it is classical, it is proportioned, but it is also forbidding. There is an element of Escorial from this facade that certainly looks a bit like a prison. And that is one thing that we can certainly say about architecture once it gets into the hands of royal patrons. It's about showing power and about making it absolutely undisputed who holds that power. So sometimes these works can be monotonous and they can be very forbidding. A close look at, for instance, Louis XIV's Versailles suggests the same thing. And we will look at that later on in the course. On the right, we have El Greco's view of Toledo. El Greco is one of these very unique artists that comes out of the Renaissance and is in a way very hard to classify either as a Renaissance artist or as even a Mannerist. The Mannerist period would have actually begun by now, what we saw in an earlier lecture with Parmigianino, the Madonna with a long neck. Nor is he very Baroque. There's a sense, I guess we could say, of drama about it that's related to Baroque art. It's hard to say. Really, El Greco, in many ways, tends to fit in much more with a kind of post-impressionist art. If we were to put this work side by side with, let's say, one of Paul Cézanne's views of Mont Saint-Victoire in France, then we could actually make a reasonable comparison in terms of the way the artist uses color, the way the artist uses planes of color to depict to depict his subject matter or her subject matter. But this is an unusual work. We need to mention El Greco, not just simply because he's a great Spanish artist, but because he's one of the great artists, and really is kind of breaking with the mold of the Renaissance tradition, and is such a standout. Well, anyway, that all being said, for now, however, I thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.